Most articles on continuous deployment seem to be about deploying new code to web servers. Programmer Joe, on the other hand, thought it would be more interesting to consider what it would take to follow a similar process for an MMO with a big installed client. So today we're going to do just that, in part 1 of a 2-part series of continuous deployment, with today's part being the deployment process itself. My name is Ryan Wienko, and this is Industry Broadcast. A big thank you goes out to Joe Ludwig, before we start today's article, for writing it, reminding everybody that his blog can be found at programmerjoe.com. As a point of comparison, here's how patches are typically developed and deployed for Pirates of the Burning Sea. First, the team makes the changes. This takes 3 weeks for monthly milestone builds, with a lot of integration happening in the last week. For a hotfix, it usually takes hours to get to the root cause of the problem, and then half an hour to make the change, build, and test on the developer's machine. Next, a build is run on the affected branch. When that's a full build, it takes about an hour and 20 minutes. Incremental builds can take 10 minutes if no major headers are changed. The form of build that people on the dev team use is copied to a shared server at this point. Next, some quick automated tests are run to fail seriously broken builds as early as possible. These take 10 minutes. After that, the build is packed up for deployment. This takes about 80 minutes. The build is now ready for manual testing, since the testers use the packed retail files to be as close to the customer install as possible. After that, we have slow, automated test runs, taking about 30 minutes. Next, concurrently with the last step if necessary, the testers run a suite of manual tests called BVTs. These take about half an hour. These tests run each nightly build even if it isn't going to be deployed, to keep people from losing too much time to bad builds. Most people wait for the BVTs to finish before upgrading to the previous night's build. 7. For milestone builds, the testers spend at least 2 weeks testing all of the new stuff. Builds are sent to Sony Online Entertainment for localization of new content at the same time. Next, a release test pass is run with larger sets of tests. These take about 3 hours. Number 9, the build is uploaded to Sony Online Entertainment for client patching and to the data center for server upgrades. This takes a few minutes for a hotfix, or 6 to 8 hours for a month's worth of changes. 10. At this point, the build is pushed to the test server. Milestone builds sit there for a couple of weeks. Hotfixes might stay for a few hours and then even go straight live in an emergency. 11. SOE pushes the patch to their patch servers without activating the patch for download. That takes between 1 and 8 hours depending on the size of the patch. 12. At the predetermined downtime, the servers are taken offline, and SOE is told to activate the patch. This usually happens at 1 a.m. PST and doesn't take any time. Customers can begin downloading the patch at this point. 13. Flying Lab operations people upgrade all servers in parallel. This takes up to 3 hours for milestone builds, but more like an hour for hotfixes. They bring the servers up locked so that they can be tested before people come in. 14. The customer service team tests every server to make sure it's pretty much working, and then operations unlocks the servers. That takes about 20 minutes. And lastly, if the build was deployed to the test server, after some days of testing, steps 11 through 14 will happen again for the live servers. This may seem like a long, slow process, but it actually works pretty well. Pirates has had 11 monthly patches since it launched, and they go fairly well. Not many other MMOs are pushing content with that frequency. Some of the slow bits, like the upload to SOE and their push to their patchers, are the result of organizational handoffs that would take quite a bit of work to change. Flying Lab also spends a fair amount of time testing manually above and over the automated tests. Those manual tests have kept thousands of bugs from going live, and as far as I'm concerned, they are an excellent use of resources. I'm not trying to bash Flying Lab in any way, just provide a baseline for what an MMO deployment process looks like. I suspect many other games have similar sequence of events going on and into each patch. Assuming minimum time for a patch, these are the times we are left with in hours and minutes. 10 minutes to run an incremental build, 10 minutes to run quick automated tests, an hour and 20 minutes to pack the build, 30 minutes to run quick manual tests and slow automated tests, 3 hours to run release pass smoke tests, 5 minutes to upload build for patching, an hour to push the build to the patchers, an hour to upgrade the servers, and 20 minutes for a final quick test being made on each server. That's 7 hours and 35 minutes of total time to deploy. If it takes 7.5 hours to deploy a new build, you obviously aren't going to get more than one of them out of an 8-hour workday. Let's forget for a moment that IMVU is able to do this in 15 minutes and pretend that our target is an hour. For now, let's assume that we will spend 10 minutes on building, 10 minutes on automated testing, 30 minutes on manual testing, and the last 10 minutes actually deploying the build. We will also assume that this is the time to deploy to the test server, and that this is slower than the actual push from test to live. Without going into detail, I'm going to assume 3 architectural changes to make these targets much more likely. First, the way that games used to pack files of assets will need to be changed to allow trivial incremental changes on every file in the game without any 80-minute pack process. I will assume that pack time can go away and be a minor part of deployment. The other assumption is that, unlike Pirates, our theoretical continuously deployed MMO will not require every object in the database to be touched when a new build is deployed, so the hours spent upgrading databases on servers is reduced to about 5 minutes of file copying. The third architectural change I will assume involves moving almost all of the patching process into the client itself and out of the launcher. This eliminates both the transfer of bits to Southern California and the push of pre-built patches out of the patcher clusters around the world. I will go into each of these assumptions in my next post, but let's just pretend for now that they appear magically and reduce our time accordingly. The amount of time spent on automated testing in this deployment process is 40 minutes. Fortunately, this work is relatively easy to spread out over multiple machines to reduce the total time involved. Assuming a test farm of at least 5 machines, we should be able to accomplish our 10-minute goal. It is possible that we could have multiple testers working in parallel to perform the manual tests more quickly. There are 230 minutes spent on testing in this sequence, so if we expect to do that amount of work with 11.5 manual testers, assuming perfect division of labor. There are 2 things wrong with that statement. The first is that perfect division of labor among 12 people is impossible, so the number is probably closer to 20. The second problem is that having a team of 12 on staff to do nothing but test new builds with tiny incremental changes to them is not worth nearly what it costs you in salaries. A much more likely outcome is that the amount of manual testing in the build process is drastically reduced. In addition to that, we can get our player base involved into the deployment testing if we swap things around a bit. So, our trimmed deployment time looks a little bit like this. 10 minutes to run incremental builds, 10 minutes to run automated tests on 5 machines, 5 minutes to upload only changed files to game servers and patch servers, 5 minutes to deploy builds on test servers, and 30 minutes to manually smoke test on public test servers. Players can test at the same time, for an hour of total time to deployment. In fact, if those 30 minutes of manually testing are your bottleneck and you can keep the pipeline full, you can push a fresh build every 30 minutes, or 16 times a day. Forget entirely about pushing to live for a moment and consider what kind of impact that would have on your test server. Your team could focus on fixing issues that players on the test server find while those players are still online. Assuming a small change that you can make in a half an hour, it would probably only take an hour from the start of work on that fix to when it is visible to the players. That pace is fast enough that it would be possible to run experiments with tuning values, prices of items, or even algorithms. Of course, for any of this to work, the entire organization needs to be arranged around responding to player feedback multiple times per day. The real advantage of a rapid deployment system is to make your change to test to respond loop faster. If your plans are set a month out and your developers don't have time to work on anything other than their assigned tasks for that entire time, there's not much point pushing builds this quickly. And that wraps it up. This is me, Ryan Wianco, signing off from IndustryBroadcast.com, hoping that you enjoyed another great article from Joe Ludwig, reminding you that his blog can be found at www.programmerjoe.com.